Mark Ellingsen. I'm a professor for the last 20 plus years at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. Now, ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center, is the largest accredited historic African American seminary in the U.S. So for this son of Norwegian immigrants, it's been a great experience, a real eye-opener, and a lot of things that really underlie my interest in this book come out of that setting. I've really been all over the map because of my passions for really understanding what it is we Christians believe and how we got to believe those things. So I've spent a lot of time in the Reformation era. I've dabbled in the modern period of Christian thought. But of late, and especially with this book, I've been spending all my time on ancient North African Christianity, both because it's good for my seminary setting and also because I'm finding things that my education in graduate school at Yale, that my education as an undergraduate and in seminary didn't teach me about the rich inheritance that we Christians draw from ancient North African Christianity. Many of the doctrines that we Christians take for granted really have their origins in ancient North African Christian thought. I'll just give a laundry list for a couple of things. How about the books of the Bible? The first list of the books of the Bible that corresponds with our list of the books of the Bible, Protestants and Catholics, comes from North Africa, from a North African bishop named Athanasius. Our teachings about Jesus having two natures, divine and human, largely come from early North African Christians. Our understanding of original sin comes from St. Augustine and his predecessors in ancient North Africa. And on top of that, even the whole institution of monasticism, which has so shaped Catholic and Eastern churches, had its origins in North Africa. How's that for a laundry list? That sounds like we owe a lot to the Christians of that region in the first centuries. How about it? Okay, now this book is really aimed at, since I'd already written a book, The Richness of Augustine, that's been used in a number of seminaries. I didn't write about Augustine this time. This was a focus more on those who came before him, his contemporaries, and even some who he really influenced. Okay, who are the theologians of North Africa everybody knows? I've mentioned Athanasius, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, just to name a few of the names that everybody knows. But then there's these African theologians that no one has paid attention to, that no one seems to recognize. To heck with where they came from, we just don't know who they are. I'll just call a list. Marius Victorinus, Dionysius of Alexandria, Synesius of Cyrene, and then you've got some women like Mary the Egyptian, Sarah, and Theodora. These are just a handful. I mean, I don't want to waste all your time on giving the whole list, but I would say the list is inclusive. Now, there are some theologians from this period that I didn't consider because there's some debate about whether they were fully African. That was part of what I'm doing in the book, is trying to point out who really comes from Africa, and if they came from Africa, were they black or were they European immigrants? That's the kind of issue that I'm getting into. But then what makes this book totally different is I'm not just talking about the lives of these famous theologians and leaders of the church. I'm doing an analysis of their theology so we can really make comparisons, so we can really see what it is we want to draw on from them. Well, of course not. Although I think those who have a background like myself and an educational background like myself, we knew when we were in seminary, we knew when we were in graduate school that they were from Africa, but it didn't register as much. And indeed, many of us thought that since these portions of North Africa were part of the Roman Empire, these early church leaders were probably white. That's the message that has come across to folks like myself, but also even to my colleagues from the African American community who went to predominantly white seminaries. They got that message too. The exciting thing is, though, that while it's true, a number of these theologians of the early church were of European descent or of Palestinian descent from Phoenicia, an awful lot of them were actually indigenous to Africa and were indeed black. Well, a couple of things. For people like myself, of European background, it opens the door to an appreciation that the message of Jesus Christ, that the heritage of his church is really for everybody, that Christianity is not just a kind of a European thing with Jewish roots, which we brought to other peoples, but in fact, it is truly a universal religion. For my African American friends and colleagues, for my students, it's also a wonderful eye-opener to come to a recognition that some of the classical doctrines that we hold dear have their roots in an African spirituality. I can just tell you the smiles on the faces of my students when I'm able to share some of this information. It's a way of saying Black lives matter when it comes to Christian theology. And then let's go back to that first point. Here's where it really matters, because don't you see the opportunities for evangelism, the opportunities for really bringing the gospel to people who really haven't been Christian before, the opportunities we have when we can say, hey, this isn't our thing we're giving you, this is indeed your thing too. This wonderful message of Jesus Christ and all the teachings that go with it. I want to be, and I hope I'm not being too defensive of predominantly white institutions here, but I don't think it's been deliberate. I think it's been more a case that, of course, when we study these figures, they're like me. I can identify with them. So, of course, they must be like me. This is a core dynamic in human nature. St. Augustine taught us that. He said it's concupiscence. We always want to make the other in our own image. So I think that's one factor. Now, I don't want to be too innocent. Could there be racist implications that nothing good can come out of Black Africa, too? Is that in the background? I'll let the audience make their own decisions on that one. Wow, that's a tough one. It's tough because it's so much debated in Afrocentric scholarship. To what degree is what happens in ancient North Africa really relevant for the African American community today? Now, we know from some genetic research that's been done that the vast majority of African Americans have their African lineage from South and West Africa, which is not the territory that we're talking about in this book. And that has led some of my colleagues to say, you know, Mark, don't overdo the Afrocentrism with this kind of book. But then other colleagues, very much in the tradition of the famous Black sociologist W.B. Du Bois, will say there's a fine line between sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa. And therefore, what happened in North Africa, what happened above the Sahara, is relevant to us in the African American community. So again, that debate goes on. Having said that, let me just tell you what I've observed. Yes, there's big differences between the Christians I'm writing about in this book. They don't teach salvation the way the historic African American Protestant churches do. They're much more in line with Catholic and Eastern Orthodox teachings than with Protestant teachings on that one. But have you ever been to an ancient African church service? I mean, a church service of the Ethiopian Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a church service of the Coptic Orthodox churches. These are the denominations that really have their roots in Africa since the 2nd or 3rd century, maybe the 1st century. Anyway, when you go to those services, they use drums. And the beat of those drums reminds me of a lot of what I hear in Black worship services here in this country and on my seminary campus. The music is largely in a minor key, very much like the spirituals of the African American community. So there's clearly an overlap in styles of worship. Not exactly the same, because these ancient churches use a liturgy, a historic liturgy, where you don't have that in the African American churches, unless they're Episcopalian, unless they're Lutheran. But there is this general connection of the music, of the use of drums, and even of dancing. So at that level, we can talk about a similarity. There's another similarity that's very interesting. Can we agree that the African American Protestant churches in this country have really been at the forefront of getting American Protestants to take their social justice issues seriously? After all, it wasn't just Martin Luther King who invented the civil rights movement. There's a long history in the black church in this country of caring for the poor, caring for the outcast, taking care of the marginalized. And guess what? Most of these early African fathers and mothers that I write about in this book advocated the same thing. Is it just a coincidence? Or could it be that the black church in America and these ancient African fathers and mothers do indeed link up in their spirituality? Well, I'm not a lone wolf on this one. I want to be fair. There is a growing number of us, not just in historic African American institutions, who see the need to recover an appreciation of the African roots of early Christianity. And so, for example, I am told that at least in one of the courses at Boston College, they are planning on using this book as a textbook. So this is indicative of the broader interests. Now, on the book jacket, you'll see what one of the faculty members at the University of South Africa thinks of this book and how helpful this book will be for her students in South Africa. And the reaction on my own campus has been very gratifying. Now, I can't speak too much more than that. The book has just come out. We haven't had any book reviews, but that's a pretty good start. What do you think? Good question. I don't know if I can name one. I've got a bunch of pets. If you're talking about my overall kind of appreciation of Christian thought, I'd want to start with my doctor father at Yale, George Lindbeck. On the other hand, when it comes to my appreciation of Martin Luther, being a Lutheran myself, certainly Jaroslav Pelikan was important. But in terms of an appreciation of the African American heritage and its impact on the early church, I would want to talk to point out at least two of my senior colleagues at the Interdenominational Theological Center, one who's deceased, the late Kenneth Henry, and also Gayrod Wilmore, Professor Gayrod Wilmore. Both of these have been mentors. So how's that? 4 instead of 1, but that's, I told you I was broad in terms of my interests, so that's why I've got so many mentors. Two aspects I think are significant. This book stands alone as a contribution to scholarship. But if you really want the whole picture of what's going on in ancient North Africa, you might want to read this along with another earlier book that's gotten a lot of buzz, has been used in some seminaries, called The Richness of Augustine. I mentioned it at the beginning of the interview. So I'd say those two go together. In terms of what's coming next and what to look for, most of these ancient African theologians, and Augustine included, were not systematic. They said things that seemed to be different, that seemed to conflict. Does that mean they're bad theologians? What I'm finding is they're very biblical. They say different things about the Christian faith in different contexts, depending on who they're trying to minister to. And so what I'm interested in this book is to try to see what this pattern looks like. When do you say certain things about the faith? When do you say other things about the faith? In what contexts? And then to look at some other great theologians down the road besides Augustine, like Martin Luther, like John Wesley, like Martin Luther King, just to name a few. And wouldn't it be interesting if the same pattern of using Christian ideas sprung up in the same contexts? That's the big picture that I have in the back of my mind, and it's where I want to go next.